A fighter aircraft is a military aircraft designed primarily for air-to-air combat against other aircraft, as opposed to bombers and attack aircraft, whose main mission is to attack ground targets. The hallmarks of a fighter are its speed, maneuverability, and small size relative to other combat aircraft. Many fighters have secondary ground attack capabilities, and some are designed as dual-purpose fighter-bombers. Often aircraft that do not fulfill the standard definition are called fighters. This may be for political or national security reasons, for advertising purposes, or other reasons. A fighter's main purpose is to establish air superiority over a battlefield. Since World War I, achieving and maintaining air superiority has been considered essential for victory in conventional warfare. The success or failure of a belligerent's efforts to gain air supremacy hinges on several factors, including the skill of its pilots, the tactical soundness of its doctrine for deploying its fighters, and the numbers and performance of those fighters. Because of the importance of air superiority, since the early days of aerial combat, armed forces have constantly competed to develop technologically superior fighters and to deploy these fighters in greater numbers, and fielding a viable fighter fleet consumes a substantial proportion of the defense budgets of modern armed forces. Terminology. The word fighter did not become the official English language term for such aircraft until after World War I. In the British Royal Flying Corps and Royal Air Force, these aircraft were referred to as Scouts into the early 1920s. The U.S. Army called their fighters pursuit aircraft from 1916 until the late 1940s. In most languages, a fighter aircraft is known as a hunter, or hunting aircraft, avion de chasse, Jagdflugzeug, avion de caza, etc. Exceptions include Russian, where a fighter is an, pronounced istribitel, meaning exterminator, and Hebrew, where it is matos krav, literally battle plane. As a part of military nomenclature, a letter is often assigned to various types of aircraft to indicate their use, along with a number to indicate the specific aircraft. The letters used to designate a fighter differ in various countries in the English-speaking world. F is now used to indicate a fighter, e.g. Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II or Supermarine Spitfire F.22, though when the pursuit designation was used in the US, they were P-types, e.g. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. In Russia I was used, Polikarpov I-16, while the French continue to use C, Nieuport 17C.1. Although the term fighter specifies aircraft designed to shoot down other aircraft, such designs are often also useful as multi-role fighter bombers, strike fighters, and sometimes lighter, fighter-sized tactical ground attack aircraft. This has always been the case. For instance, the Sopwith Camel and other fighting scouts of World War I performed a great deal of ground attack work. In World War II, the USAF and RAF often favored fighters over dedicated light bombers or dive bombers, and types such as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and Hawker Hurricane that were no longer competitive as aerial combat fighters were relegated to ground attack. Several aircraft, such as the F-111 and F-117, have received fighter designations though they had no fighter capability due to political or other reasons. The F-111B variant was originally intended for a fighter role with the U.S. Navy, but it was cancelled. This blurring follows the use of fighters from their earliest days for attack or strike operations against ground targets by means of strafing or dropping small bombs and incendiaries. Versatile multi-role fighter bombers such as the McDonnell Douglas F/A-18 Hornet are a less expensive option than having a range of specialized aircraft types. Some of the most expensive fighters such as the U.S. Grumman F-14 Tomcat, McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle, Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor and Russian Sukhoi Su-27 were employed as all-weather interceptors as well as air superiority fighter aircraft, while commonly developing air-to-ground roles late in their careers. An interceptor is generally an aircraft intended to target, or intercept, bombers and so often trades maneuverability for climb rate. Development overview. Fighters were developed in World War I to deny enemy aircraft and dirigibles the ability to gather information by reconnaissance over the battlefield. Early fighters were very small and lightly armed by later standards, and most were biplanes built with a wooden frame, covered with fabric, and with a maximum speed of about 100 miles per hour, 160 kilometers per hour. As control of the airspace over armies became increasingly important, all of the major powers developed fighters to support their military operations. Between the wars, wood was largely replaced in part or whole by metal tubing, and finally aluminium-stressed skin structures, monocoque, began to predominate. On August 15, 1914, Miodrag Tomic encountered an enemy plane while conducting a reconnaissance flight over Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian aviator initially waved at Tomic, who waved back. The enemy pilot then took a revolver and began shooting at Tomic's plane. Tomic produced a pistol of his own and fired back. He swerved away from the Austro-Hungarian plane and the two aircraft eventually parted ways. It was considered the first exchange of fire between aircraft in history. Within weeks, all Serbian and Austro-Hungarian aircraft were armed. The Serbians equipped their planes with 8mm, 0.31 in, Schwarzlos MGM.07/12 machine guns, 6 100-round boxes of ammunition and several bombs. By World War II, most fighters were all-metal monoplanes armed with batteries of machine guns or cannons, and some were capable of speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, 640 kilometers per hour. Most fighters up to this point had one engine, but a number of twin-engine fighters were built. However, they were found to be outmatched against single-engine fighters and were relegated to other tasks, such as night fighters equipped with primitive radar sets. By the end of the war, turbojet engines were replacing piston engines as the means of propulsion, further increasing aircraft speed. Since the weight of the engine was so much less than on piston-engined fighters, having two engines was no longer a handicap and one or two were used, depending on requirements. This in turn required the development of ejection seats so the pilot could escape NG suits to counter the much greater forces being applied to the pilot during maneuvers. In the 1950s, radar was fitted to day fighters, since pilots could no longer see far enough ahead to prepare for any opposition. Since then, radar capabilities have grown enormously and are now the primary method of target acquisition. Wings were made thinner and swept back to reduce transonic drag, which required new manufacturing methods to obtain sufficient strength. Skins were no longer sheet metal riveted to a structure, but milled from large slabs of alloy. The sound barrier was broken, and after a few false starts due to required changes in controls, speeds quickly reached Mach 2, past which aircraft can't maneuver to avoid attack. Air-to-air missiles largely replaced guns and rockets in the early 1960s since both were believed unusable at the speeds being attained. However, the Vietnam War showed that guns still had a role to play, and most fighters built since then are fitted with cannon, typically between 20 and 30 mm in caliber, in addition to missiles. Most modern combat aircraft can carry at least a pair of air-to-air missiles. In the 1970s, turbofans replaced turbojets, improving fuel economy enough that the last piston-engine support aircraft could be replaced with jets, making multi-role combat aircraft possible. Honeycomb structures began to replace milled structures, and the first composite components began to appear on components subjected to little stress. With the steady improvements in computers, defensive systems have become increasingly efficient. To counter this, stealth technologies have been pursued by the United States, Russia, India, and China. The first step was to find ways to reduce the aircraft's reflectivity to radar waves by burying the engines, eliminating sharp corners and diverting any reflections away from the radar sets of opposing forces. Various materials were found to absorb the energy from radar waves, and were incorporated into special finishes that have since found widespread application. Composite structures have become widespread, including major structural components, and have helped to counterbalance the steady increases in aircraft weight. Most modern fighters are larger and heavier than World War II medium bombers. Piston engine fighters. World War I. The word fighter was first used to describe a two-seater aircraft with sufficient lift to carry a machine gun and its operator as well as the pilot. Some of the first such fighters belonged to the Gunbus series of experimental gun carriers of the British Vickers Company that culminated in the Vickers F.B.5 gunbus of 1914. The main drawback of this type of aircraft was its lack of speed. Planners quickly realized that an aircraft intended to destroy its kind in the air had to be fast enough to catch its quarry. Another type of military aircraft was to form the basis for an effective fighter in the modern sense of the word. It was based on the small fast aircraft developed before the war for such air races as the Gordon Bennett Cup and Schneider Trophy. The military scout airplane was not expected to carry serious armament, but rather to rely on its speed to reach the scout or reconnoiter location and return quickly to report, essentially an aerial horse. British scout aircraft, in this sense, included the Sopwith Tabloid and Bristol Scout. French equivalents included the Morane-Saulnier N. Soon after the commencement of the war, pilots armed themselves with pistols, carbines, grenades, and an assortment of improvised weapons. Many of these proved ineffective as the pilot had to fly his airplane while attempting to aim a handheld weapon and make a difficult deflection shot. The first step in finding a real solution was to mount the weapon on the aircraft, but the propeller remained a problem since the best direction to shoot is straight ahead. Numerous solutions were tried. A second crew member behind the pilot could aim and fire a swivel-mounted machine gun at enemy airplanes, however, this limited the area of coverage chiefly to the rear hemisphere, and effective coordination of the pilot's maneuvering with the gunner's aiming was difficult. This option was chiefly employed as a defensive measure on two-seater reconnaissance aircraft from 1915 on. Both the SPAD SA and the Royal Aircraft Factory B.E.9 added a second crewman ahead of the engine in a pod, but this was both hazardous to the second crewman and limited performance. The Sopwith L.R.T.Tr similarly added a pod on the top wing with no better luck. An alternative was to build a pusher scout such as the Airco DH.2, with the propeller mounted behind the pilot. The main drawback was that the high drag of a pusher-type's tail structure made it slower than a similar tractor aircraft. A better solution for a single-seat scout was to mount the machine gun, rifles and pistols having been dispensed with, to fire forwards but outside the propeller arc. Wing guns were tried, but the unreliable weapons available required frequent clearing of jammed rounds and misfires and remained impractical until after the war. Mounting the machine gun over the top wing worked well and was used long after the ideal solution was found. The Newport 11 of 1916 and Royal Aircraft Factory S.E.5 of 1918 both used this system with considerable success. However, this placement made aiming difficult and the location made it difficult for a pilot to both maneuver and have access to the gun's breech. The British Foster mounting was specifically designed for this kind of application, fitted with the Lewis machine gun, which due to its design was unsuitable for synchronizing. The need to arm a tractor scout with a forward-firing gun whose bullets passed through the propeller arc was evident even before the outbreak of war, and inventors in both France and Germany devised mechanisms that could time the firing of the individual rounds to avoid hitting the propeller blades. Franz Schneider, a Swiss engineer, had patented such a device in Germany in 1913, but his original work was not followed up. French aircraft designer Raymond Saulnier patented a practical device in April 1914, but trials were unsuccessful because of the propensity of the machine gun employed to hang fire due to unreliable ammunition. In December 1914, French aviator Roland Garros asked Saulnier to install his synchronization gear on Garros Morane-Saulnier Type L. Unfortunately, the gas-operated Hotchkiss machine gun he was provided had an erratic rate of fire and it was impossible to synchronize it with a spinning propeller. As an interim measure, the propeller blades were armored and fitted with metal wedges to protect the pilot from ricochets. Garros' modified monoplane was first flown in March 1915 and he began combat operations soon thereafter. Garros scored 3 victories in 3 weeks before he himself was downed on April 18 and his airplane, along with its synchronization gear and propeller, was captured by the Germans. Meanwhile, the synchronization gear, called the Stangensteuerung in German, 4-push rod control system, devised by the engineers of Anthony Fokker's firm, was the first system to see production contracts, and would make the Fokker-Eindecker monoplane a feared name over the Western Front, despite its being an adaptation of an obsolete pre-war French Morane-Saulnier racing airplane, with a mediocre performance and poor flight characteristics. The first victory for the Eindecker came on July 1, 1915, when Lieutenant Kurt Wintgens, flying with the Feldflieger Abteilung 6 unit on the Western Front, forced down a Morane-Saulnier-type L2-seat parasol monoplane just east of Luneville. Wintgens aircraft, one of the 5 Fokker M.5K/MG production prototype examples of the Eindecker, was armed with a synchronized, air-cooled aviation version of the Parabellum MG-14 machine gun. The success of the Eindecker kicked off a competitive cycle of improvement among the combatants, both sides striving to build ever more capable single-seat fighters. The Albatros DI and Sopwith Pup of 1916 set the classic pattern followed by fighters for about 20 years. Most were biplanes and only rarely monoplanes or triplanes. The strong box structure of the biplane provided a rigid wing that allowed the accurate lateral control essential for dogfighting. They had a single operator, who flew the aircraft and also controlled its armament. They were armed with 1 or 2 Maxim or Vickers machine guns, which were easier to synchronize than other types. Firing through the propeller arc gun bridges were directly in front of the pilot, with obvious implications in case of accidents, but jams could be cleared in flight, while aiming was simplified. The use of metal aircraft structures was pioneered before World War I by Breguet but would find its biggest proponent in Anthony Fokker, who used chrome molybdenum steel tubing for the fuselage structure of all his fighter designs, while the innovative German engineer Hugo Junkers developed 2 all-metal, single-seat fighter monoplane designs with cantilever wings, the strictly experimental Junkers J-2 private venture aircraft, made with steel, and some 40 examples of the Junkers DI, made with corrugated duralumin, all based on his experience in creating the pioneering Junkers J-1 all-metal airframe technology demonstration aircraft of late 1915. While Fokker would pursue steel tube fuselages with wooden wings until the late 1930s, and Junkers would focus on corrugated sheet metal, Dornier was the first to build a fighter, the Dornier Zeppelin DI, made with pre-stressed sheet aluminium and having cantilevered wings, a form that would replace all others in the 1930s. As collective combat experience grew, the more successful pilots such as Oswald Boelk, Max Immelmann, and Edward Mannich developed innovative tactical formations and maneuvers to enhance their air units' combat effectiveness. Allied and before 1918 German pilots of World War I were not equipped with parachutes, so in-flight fires or structural failure were often fatal. Parachutes were well developed by 1918, having previously been used by balloonists, and were adopted by the German flying services during the course of that year. The well-known and feared Manfred von Richthofen Red Baron was wearing one when he was killed, but the Allied command continued to oppose their use on various grounds. In April 1917, during a brief period of German aerial supremacy, a British pilot's average life expectancy was 93 flying hours, or about 3 weeks of active service. More than 50,000 airmen from both sides died during the war. Interwar period, 1919–38. Fighter development stagnated between the wars, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, where budgets were small. In France, Italy, and Russia, where large budgets continued to allow major development, both monoplanes and all-metal structures were common. By the end of the 1920s, however, those countries overspent themselves and were overtaken in the 1930s by those powers that hadn't been spending heavily, namely the British, the Americans and the Germans. Given limited defense budgets, air forces tended to be conservative in their aircraft purchases, and biplanes remained popular with pilots because of their agility, and remained in service long after they had ceased to be competitive. Designs such as the Gloucester Gladiator, Fiat CR.42, and Polycarpov I-15 were common even in the late 1930s, and many were still in service as late as 1942. Up until the mid-1930s, the majority of fighters in the US, the UK, Italy and Russia remained fabric-covered biplanes. Fighter armament eventually began to be mounted inside the wings, outside the arc of the propeller, though most designs retained 2 synchronized machine guns directly ahead of the pilot, where they were more accurate, that being the strongest part of the structure, reducing the vibration to which the guns were subjected to. Shooting with this traditional arrangement was also easier for the further reason that the guns shot directly ahead in the direction of the aircraft's flight, up to the limit of the gun's range, unlike wing-mounted guns which to be effective required to be harmonized, that is, preset to shoot at an angle by ground crews so that their bullets would converge on a target area a set distance ahead of the fighter. Rifle caliber .30 and .303 in, 7.62 mm, caliber guns remained the norm, with larger weapons either being too heavy and cumbersome or deemed unnecessary against such lightly built aircraft. It was not considered unreasonable to use World War I-style armament to counter enemy fighters, as there was insufficient air-to-air combat during most of the period to disprove this notion. The rotary engine, popular during World War I, quickly disappeared, its development having reached the point where rotational forces prevented more fuel and air from being delivered to the cylinders, which limited horsepower. They were replaced chiefly by the stationary radial engine, though major advances led to inline engines, which gained ground with several exceptional engines including the 1145 cu in, 18.76 liters, V12 Curtiss D12. Aircraft engines increased in power several-fold over the period, going from a typical 180 HP, 130 kilowatts, in the 900 kg Fokker D.7 of 1918 to 900 HP, 670 kilowatts, in the 2,500 kg Curtiss P-36 of 1936. The debate between the sleek inline engines versus the more reliable radial models continued, with naval air forces preferring the radial engines, and land-based forces often choosing inline units. Radial designs did not require a separate, and vulnerable, cooling system, but had increased drag. Inline engines often had a better power-to-weight ratio, but there were radial engines that kept working even after having suffered significant battle damage. Some air forces experimented with heavy fighters, called destroyers by the Germans. These were larger, usually twin-engined aircraft, sometimes adaptations of light or medium bomber types. Such designs typically had greater internal fuel capacity, thus longer range, and heavier armament than their single-engine counterparts. In combat, they proved vulnerable to more agile single-engine fighters. The primary driver of fighter innovation, right up to the period of rapid rearmament in the late 1930s, were not military budgets, but civilian aircraft racing. Aircraft designed for these races introduced innovations like streamlining and more powerful engines that would find their way into the fighters of World War II. The most significant of these was the Schneider Trophy races, where competition grew so fierce, only national governments could afford to enter. At the very end of the interwar period in Europe came the Spanish Civil War. This was just the opportunity the German Luftwaffe, Italian Regia Aeronautica, and the Soviet Union's Red Air Force needed to test their latest aircraft. Each party sent numerous aircraft types to support their sides in the conflict. In the dogfights over Spain, the latest Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters did well, as did the Soviet Polikarpov I-16. The German design had considerably more room for development, however, and the lessons learned led to greatly improved models in World War II. The Russians, whose side lost, failed to keep up, and despite newer models coming into service, I-16s were outfought by the improved Bf-109s in World War II, while remaining the most common Soviet frontline fighter into 1942. For their part, the Italians developed several monoplanes such as the Fiat 50 Guaranis, but being short on funds, were forced to continue operating obsolete Fiat CR.42 biplanes. From the early 1930s the Japanese had been at war against both the Chinese nationalists and the Russians in China, and used the experience to improve both training and aircraft, replacing biplanes with modern cantilever monoplanes and creating a cadre of exceptional pilots for use in the Pacific War. In the United Kingdom, at the behest of Neville Chamberlain, more famous for his Peace in Our Time speech, the entire British aviation industry was retooled, allowing it to change quickly from fabric-covered metal-framed biplanes to cantilever-stressed skin monoplanes in time for the war with Germany. The period of improving the same biplane design over and over was now coming to an end, and the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire finally started to supplant the Gloucester Gladiator and Hawker Fury biplanes, but many of the former remained in frontline service well past the start of World War II. While not a combatant themselves in Spain, they absorbed many of the lessons learned in time to use them. The Spanish Civil War also provided an opportunity for updating fighter tactics. One of the innovations to result from the aerial warfare experience this conflict provided was the development of the finger four formation by the German pilot Werner Mulders. Each fighter squadron, German, Staffel, was divided into several flights, Schwarm, of 4 aircraft. Each Schwarm was divided into 2 Rotten, which was a pair of aircraft. Each Rot was composed of a leader and a wingman. This flexible formation allowed the pilots to maintain greater situational awareness, and the 2 Rotten could split up at any time and attack on their own. The finger four would become widely adopted as the fundamental tactical formation over the course of World War. World War II. World War II featured fighter combat on a larger scale than any other conflict to date. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel noted the effect of air power: anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. Throughout the war, fighters performed their conventional role in establishing air superiority through combat with other fighters and through bomber interception, and also often performed roles such as tactical air support and reconnaissance. Fighter design varied widely among combatants. The Japanese and Italians favored lightly armed and armored but highly maneuverable designs such as the Japanese Nakajima Ki-27, Nakajima Ki-43, and Mitsubishi A6M0, and Italy's Fiat 50 Guaranis and Macchi MC.200. In contrast, designers in the United Kingdom, Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States believed that the increased speed of fighter aircraft would create G-forces unbearable to pilots who attempted maneuvering dogfights typical of the First World War, and their fighters were instead optimized for speed and firepower. In practice, while light, highly maneuverable aircraft did possess some advantages in fighter versus fighter combat, those could usually be overcome by sound tactical doctrine, and the design approach of the Italians and Japanese made their fighters ill-suited as interceptors or attack aircraft. European theater. During the invasion of Poland and the Battle of France, Luftwaffe fighters, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109, held air superiority, and the Luftwaffe played a major role in German victories in these campaigns. During the Battle of Britain, however, British Hurricanes and Spitfires proved roughly equal to Luftwaffe fighters. Additionally, Britain's radar-based dowding system directing fighters onto German attacks and the advantages of fighting above Britain's home territory allowed the RAF to deny Germany air superiority, saving the UK from possible German invasion and dealing the Axis a major defeat early in the Second World War. On the Eastern Front, Soviet fighter forces were overwhelmed during the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa. This was a result of the tactical surprise at the outset of the campaign, the leadership vacuum within the Soviet military left by the Great Purge, and the general inferiority of Soviet designs at the time, such as the obsolescent I-15 biplane and the I-16. More modern Soviet designs, including the MiG-3, Lag-3, and Yak-1, had not yet arrived in numbers and in any case were still inferior to the Messerschmitt Bf 109. As a result, during the early months of these campaigns, Axis air forces destroyed large numbers of Red Air Force aircraft on the ground and in one-sided dogfights. In the later stages on the Eastern Front, Soviet training and leadership improved, as did their equipment. Since 1942, Soviet designs such as the Yakovlev Yak-9 and Lavochkin La-5 had performance comparable to the German Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Fw 190. Also, significant numbers of British, and later US, fighter aircraft were supplied to aid the Soviet war effort as part of Lend-Lease, with the Bell P-39 Airacobra proving particularly effective in the lower altitude combat typical of the Eastern Front. The Soviets were also helped indirectly by the American and British bombing campaigns, which forced the Luftwaffe to shift many of its fighters away from the Eastern Front in defense against these raids. The Soviets increasingly were able to challenge the Luftwaffe, and while the Luftwaffe maintained a qualitative edge over the Red Air Force for much of the war, the increasing numbers and efficacy of the Soviet Air Force were critical to the Red Army's efforts at turning back and eventually annihilating the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, air combat on the Western Front had a much different character. Much of this combat was centered around the strategic bombing campaigns of the RAF and the USAF against German industry intended to wear down the Luftwaffe. Axis fighter aircraft focused on defending against Allied bombers while Allied fighters' main role was as bomber escorts. The RAF raided German cities at night, and both sides developed radar-equipped night fighters for these battles. The Americans, in contrast, flew daylight bombing raids into Germany. Unescorted consolidated B-24 Liberators and Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, however, proved unable to fend off German interceptors, primarily Bf-109S and Fw-190S. With the later arrival of long-range fighters, particularly the North American P-51 Mustang, American fighters were able to escort far into Germany on daylight raids and established control of the skies over Western Europe. By the time of Operation Overlord in June 1944, the Allies had gained near complete air superiority over the Western Front. This cleared the way both for intensified strategic bombing of German cities and industries, and for the tactical bombing of battlefield targets. With the Luftwaffe largely cleared from the skies, Allied fighters increasingly served as attack aircraft. Allied fighters, by gaining air superiority over the European battlefield, played a crucial role in the eventual defeat of the Axis, which Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the German Luftwaffe, summed up when he said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Pacific Theater. Major air combat during the war in the Pacific began with the entry of the Western Allies following Japan's attack against Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service primarily operated the Mitsubishi A6M0, and the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service flew the Nakajima K.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.